All right, so in this video, we are going to talk about some modern, meaning post-Cold War, nationalist and separatist conflicts. And what's interesting, or maybe kind of depressing about this, is that a lot of these conflicts are about old reasons for fighting. So, a lot of these conflicts are over things like language or religion. And these are things that we've seen conflicts over since the 16th century, 15th century. These are things that were driving the 30 Years' War and the French Wars of Religion. So, despite this being a quote unquote modern thing, these reasons go back centuries. And it's kind of depressing that these are still things that Europeans are having conflicts over. So I guess at the end of this, and there's no real answer for this, we have to ask the question, why do these conflicts keep happening? And there's not a good answer to that. And for a lot of these things, they're so modern that we don't really even know what's going to happen because of them. But let's look at a few examples. We're going to take a brief look at a few of these examples. We'll kind of go in order of least violent to most violent. So we'll start in a place that you may not think to start, and that's Belgium. So remember when we created Belgium in the 1830s, Belgium was kind of sandwiched between France to the south and the Netherlands to the north. And Belgium reflects that. The northern part of Belgium is the part closest to the Netherlands. So northern Belgium is more Dutch. It's more Dutch speaking. This area is called Flanders. And the people who live here are called the Flemish. This area is also the richer half of Belgium. The other half, the southern half, is more French speaking. And it is called Wallonia, and the people who live there are called Walloons. And this area is generally poorer. Now, when we say rich and poor, Belgium is a very rich country, so it's just poorer than the northern part. The poorer part of Belgium is still richer than most of the world. The problem here is that there has grown a pretty healthy resentment in the northern part of Belgium. There is a growing Flemish Separatist movement. That is based on old resentments towards the French. So for a long time, French was the official language of Belgium. And French was the language of the ruling class. But now, the Dutch speakers are wealthier and they resent the French. They resent the Walloons. This separatist movement is also associated with a far-right political party that is anti-immigrant and anti-Islamic. So there hasn't been any violence yet, but there's a lot of angry rhetoric going on. And the reason that this is brought up as an example is because right in the middle of all of this is the city of Brussels, which is the headquarters of the EU. So we'll talk more about the EU in our next video, but the EU's purpose was to stop this kind of nationalism from starting in the first place. And here we see the nationalism in Belgium arising right underneath the EU. Okay, next spot we're going to take a look at is in Spain. In Spain, we're going to talk about the Basque people. Now, the Basque nation is a very distinct culture and nation inside of Spain. And they're kind of most well known for their unique language. The language of the Basque people, Catalan, is unique. There are no languages spoken today that are any way related to this language of the Basque people. And so their language has kind of become a important cultural touchstone for them. And we'll see what happens as a result of Franco taking control of Spain. So the Basque people had negotiated a level of autonomy with the Kingdom of Spain. They were pretty much left alone. They paid their taxes, and the Spanish essentially just let them be. And this was the situation up until the Spanish Civil War. Now, during the Spanish Civil War, the Basques sided with the Republicans. against Franco. But they switched sides in 1937, mostly because they struck a deal with the Vatican and the Vatican was associated with Franco. Now, this didn't work out so well for the Basque people because Franco persecuted the Basque people and outlawed their language. And doing so sparked a, depending on how you look at it, a guerrilla campaign or a set of freedom fighters, depending on how you want to look at it, that attacked Franco's government. And this group was called ETA. And ETA carried out a bombing campaign inside of Spain. And in 1973, they managed to assassinate Franco's prime minister. So they were a relatively successful terrorist organization. They managed to assassinate an important Spanish figure. However, in 1976, Franco died. But ETA kept going. Even after Spain started to transition into democracy. And without the persecution, public support for ETA plummeted. So they had been pushing for independence, but now, without the persecution from the Spanish government, there was really nothing to fight back against. So in 2006, they issued a general ceasefire. And in 2016, they ceased all operations. And really, we're back to where we started. The Basque Country has a level of autonomy within Spain. So for about 40 years, there was a lot of violence, and roughly about 1,000 people were killed in this campaign to get back to pretty much where they started. Now, some Basque people still want to be independent, but most are happy to just have their language and their culture protected by the Spanish, and for the most part, that's what's going on. All right, next up, the third place we're going to take a look at is Russia and Chechnya. So Chechnya is a region in southern Russia near the Caucasus Mountains. So down by the border with Georgia. And the Chechens are very different than the Russians. And again, we're going back to these ideas of language and religion. The Chechens speak Chechen and are mostly Muslims. So in 1991, when the Soviet Union is disintegrating, Chechnya takes this opportunity to declare independence. This was not going to stand for the Russians. This would serve as a bad example for Russia, and so they did their best to keep Chechnya. If Chechnya declares independence, then other places within Russia might decide to declare independence, and Russia couldn't stand for that. However, the tensions kept rising between Russia and Chechnya, and in 1994, Russia invaded. And surprisingly, Chechnya stood back up. So Russia invaded, and Chechnya took this, and they weren't defeated. In fact, they lasted until 1996, when the Russians offered to negotiate. So the Chechens had basically won. And between 1996 and 1999, Chechnya was essentially independent. This changes in 1999. In 1999, there were a series of bombings in Moscow blamed on the Chechens. Now, it's most likely the Chechens didn't do this. It's theorized that the Russians did this to bolster the presidential campaign of Vladimir Putin. Who won the presidency. He became president the next year. But the Russians used this as an excuse to invade Chechnya again. And we get the second Russian-Chechen War that goes between 1999 and 2009, and this was a Russian victory. And a pro-Putin governor was installed in Chechnya. All right, the last place we're going to look at is Yugoslavia. Now, we haven't really spoken too much about Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia was a kind of hodgepodge of small Slavic nations created after World War I. Now, these Slavic nations, the Serbians, the Croatians, the Montenegrins, the Macedonians, the Slovenians, all of these small Slavic nations didn't really get along with each other, but they were too small to have their own country, so they were all kind of mashed together into this thing called Yugoslavia. Now, during World War II, the Nazis invaded, and Yugoslav resistance was led by this guy named Marshal, that was his title, Marshal Joseph Tito. And Tito goes on to leads post-war Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was a communist country. Tito was well liked by everybody. And so through his charisma and will, he held Yugoslavia together. Because everybody liked and admired and respected Tito. He dies, though, in 1980. And in 1980, Yugoslavia starts to fall apart. And in 1992, Yugoslavia disintegrates like the Soviet Union did. And here's where things start to get messy. None of these little Slavic nations were happy being in Yugoslavia. But the biggest problem happened in Bosnia. Bosnia was one of the pieces of Yugoslavia. And Bosnia was evenly divided between ethnic groups. So there wasn't a very clear idea of what group of people were actually in charge of Bosnia. So there were three groups of people in Bosnia that had large percentages of the population. About 40% of the population was Bosnian Muslims, and they were the largest group. About 30% were Orthodox Serbs, and about 20% were Catholic Croatians. So while the Muslims were the largest group, the majority of the country was made up of different kinds of Christians. The problem starts in 1992 when the Bosnian Serbs and Serbians from Serbia tried to create a greater Serbia by uniting all the Serbs. And if that sounds familiar, that's kind of what sparked World War I. So Serbs from Bosnia and Serbs from Serbia are going to start a conflict in Bosnia. And this is going to quickly devolve into war crimes and ethnic cleansing. And the worst example of this happens in 1995 with the Srebrenica massacre. So Srebrenica was a town, and it was named a safe zone in this war by NATO. NATO had called this town a safe zone for Muslims because they were the ones who were being targeted by the Serbians. 8,000 Muslim civilians were killed by Serbian soldiers in July of 1995. And what makes this even worse is that from eyewitness testimony, there were lots of NATO soldiers around, and they just did nothing to stop this from happening. So not only was this ethnic cleansing, but it was ethnic cleansing in Europe after we had all these lessons from the Holocaust, and we had NATO soldiers who were supposed to be protecting this area, and they did nothing to stop it. So this was a complete failure on just about every level, and 8,000 people were killed as a result of it. So in our next video, we're going to talk about how do we try to keep these nationalist and separatist tendencies from turning violent. And so tomorrow we'll look at the European Union and how it tried to prevent things like this from happening in the future. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.